Most people imagine the world of Jesus as a purely spiritual landscape, a distant religious past filled with sandals on dusty roads, wandering teachers delivering moral sermons, and miraculous events unfolding against a quiet, reverent backdrop. In modern memory, this period is often stripped of its material reality and reduced to symbolism. Faith replaces hunger. Theology replaces survival. But for the people who actually lived in Judea at the beginning of the first century, daily life was not organized around abstract spirituality. It was organized around money, or more accurately, around the constant absence of it. The world into which Jesus was born was shaped by one of the most unequal economic systems the ancient Mediterranean had ever produced. This was not incidental. Inequality was not a side effect of Roman rule, it was the foundation of it. Judea existed inside the Roman Empire, the most sophisticated extraction machine the ancient world had ever seen. Rome did not conquer territories to integrate them or to develop them for mutual prosperity. It conquered them to fund the center. Provinces existed to move wealth outward: grain, silver, labor, and taxes flowing from the edges of the empire toward Rome itself. Judea was one of those edges, and it was a fragile one. It was not a wealthy province. It was largely rural and agricultural, dependent on small plots of land worked by families with almost no margin for error. Most people lived directly off what they could grow. These were not farms in the modern commercial sense, they were subsistence plots, just large enough to keep a family alive in a good year. A bad harvest did not mean lower profits, it meant hunger, and hunger quickly turned into debt. Rome did not govern Judea with compassion or long-term concern for stability at the local level. It governed through a combination of imperial officials and local elites whose loyalty was purchased through power and privilege. Kings like Herod the Great ruled with Roman approval. After his death, Roman prefects, most famously Pontius Pilate, took direct administrative control. Their job was not to improve living standards or protect communities. Their mandate was simple: maintain order and ensure that revenue continued to flow. Taxes were the backbone of the system, and this is where modern assumptions fail us. Today, people think of taxes as something paid on income, profit, or growth. In Judea, taxes were owed regardless of outcome. You did not pay because you succeeded. You paid because you existed. There were land taxes, produce taxes, head taxes, tolls on roads and marketplaces, and customs duties on goods. On top of that came religious taxes. Miss a payment, and the consequences were immediate and severe. There was no appeals process, no protective bureaucracy, no safety net. Tax collection was outsourced to local contractors, tax farmers who paid Rome up front for the right to collect, and then recovered their investment by extracting as much as possible from the population. Abuse was not a flaw in this system. It was the incentive. When people could not pay, they borrowed. Debt was everywhere in first-century Judea, and it functioned very differently from modern debt. There was no bankruptcy, no restructuring, no institutional forgiveness. Interest accumulated relentlessly, and the collateral was almost always land. One bad year could push a family into a spiral they would never escape. The pattern repeated itself across generations. A farmer planted crops, weather turned. The harvest failed. Taxes were still due. The farmer borrowed from a local lender, often a wealthy landowner or an elite connected to temple authorities. Interest accrued, the following year brought only partial recovery. Debt remained. Eventually, the land was seized. The farmer became a tenant on what had once been his own property, or a day laborer, or vanished entirely into the margins of society. This was not an accident, it was structural. Over time, land consolidated into fewer and fewer hands. Small plots disappeared. Large estates expanded. Wealth clustered around elites, aligned with Roman authority and temple administration. The majority of the population sank into permanent precarity. The economy did not merely produce poverty, it reproduced it. There was no state support for those who fell, no unemployment assistance, no public relief. Families were the only buffer, and when too many families collapsed at once, even that buffer failed. Community charity existed, but it was limited and inconsistent. It could ease suffering, but it could not reverse dispossession. It treated symptoms, not causes. Debt was not only financial, it was social. Losing land meant losing status, security, and identity. A family's future could be erased by a drought, a tax increase, or a single missed payment. This is the world Jesus was born into, and it is crucial to say this clearly. Most people were not poor because they were lazy, immoral, or cursed. They were poor because the system required them to be. Rome needed surplus. Local elites needed rent. The temple needed revenue. All of that pressure rested on people with the least margin for survival. The result was tension constant, simmering, and volatile. Judea was not peaceful. Rebellions flared repeatedly. Banditry was not merely criminal behavior, it was economic desperation. Messianic movements did not emerge in times of comfort. They emerged in collapse. Modern audiences often misunderstand why the message of Jesus resonated so deeply. When people listened to sermons about debt forgiveness, release, justice, and reversal, they were not hearing metaphors. They were hearing survival strategies. When they heard talk of the poor, it was not abstract compassion. It was their neighbors, their families, themselves. Words like forgiveness carried economic weight. They implied cancellation, reset, escape, and escape was rare. The Roman system was efficient, not humane. It extracted wealth upward with remarkable consistency. It tolerated suffering as long as order was maintained. Stability mattered more than fairness. Revenue mattered more than lives. Everyone knew it. There was no illusion that the system was fair, no belief that hard work guaranteed safety. There was only endurance and resentment and the hope that something might break the cycle. That hope is where ideas become dangerous. When a system is this tight, even small changes feel revolutionary. Even words can destabilize it. By the time Jesus began speaking publicly, economic pressure had reached a breaking point. The audience was primed. The fractures were visible. The anger was real. The desperation was rational. This was not background context. It was the engine. To understand why the economy of Judea felt so inescapable, you have to examine the institution people believed was meant to protect them: the temple. Today, the temple in Jerusalem is often imagined as purely religious, a place of prayer and sacrifice. In economic terms, it was one of the most powerful financial institutions in the region. It functioned simultaneously as a treasury, a bank, a tax authority, and a court. Every adult Jewish male was required to pay a yearly temple tax, enforced and payable only in a specific silver coin. That requirement created currency exchange markets, exchange fees, approved vendors, temple-sanctioned prices. Sacrifice cost money. Forgiveness cost money. Access to the sacred was monetized. The temple elite were deeply intertwined with Roman authority. High priests were appointed with Roman approval. Stability mattered more than righteousness. Cooperation mattered more than justice. The institution that claimed moral authority also benefited from the same extraction logic that impoverished the people. People noticed. When Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, it was not an act of random outrage. It was an economic confrontation. He was not attacking prayer. He was attacking the machinery that monetized access to God. He called it a den of robbers because extraction had replaced justice. That crossed a line. Rome tolerated prophets. It tolerated teachers. What it did not tolerate was instabilities, especially near Passover, when Jerusalem, filled with crowds and tension, turned explosive. From the perspective of temple authorities, Jesus was not merely preaching. He was disrupting flows, challenging legitimacy, undermining the balance that kept them in power and kept Rome satisfied. The conflict was not primarily theological. It was economic and political. The system could tolerate suffering. It could tolerate inequality. What it could not tolerate was a narrative that made people question why suffering existed and whether it was necessary. Once people stop accepting debt as destiny, extraction becomes harder to enforce. What followed was not immediate collapse, but escalation. Within a generation, Judea erupted into full-scale revolt. By 70 CE, Jerusalem was destroyed, the temple dismantled stone by stone, and Roman control rebuilt with greater efficiency and less moral restraint. Rome won militarily, but it never fully regained control of the story. Jesus did not challenge Rome's ability to extract wealth. He challenged the moral logic that made extraction feel inevitable and justified. That is why his impact cannot be measured in regime change. It reshaped how people understood power, debt, legitimacy, and suffering. To understand why Jesus' actions triggered such a strong reaction, it is necessary to strip away the modern idea of the temple as merely a spiritual sanctuary and see it as the population of Judea experienced it. an institution where belief, money, and power were fused into a single system. The temple was not just a house of worship, it was the economic heart of the region. Its courtyards were filled not only with prayers, but with transactions. Sacrifice was not symbolic, it was regulated, priced, approved, and enforced. The temple controlled acceptable currency, authorized vendors, and dictated ritual requirements that could not be fulfilled without payment. In effect, it functioned as a gatekeeper between the people and God, and that gate had a cost. The yearly temple tax alone represented a heavy burden for families already crushed by Roman extraction. But the structure went further. Pilgrims arriving from rural areas or distant regions were required to exchange their local currency for the Tyrian shekel. The only coin accepted due to its silver content, this necessity created a permanent market for money changers, whose fees were not incidental but institutionalized. Sacrificial animals were often rejected if brought from outside, forcing worshippers to buy temple-approved offerings at inflated prices. Poverty did not exempt anyone. It merely reduced the scale of payment, not the obligation itself. What made this arrangement especially volatile was the alignment between temple elites and Roman authority. High priests were appointed not by popular consent or spiritual reputation, but through political approval. Their legitimacy flowed upward, not outward. Their survival depended on maintaining order, preventing unrest, and ensuring that religious life did not interfere with Roman revenue streams. As a result, the temple became an institution that preached holiness while profiting from inequality. It spoke of forgiveness while reinforcing debt. It promised divine justice while operating within an extractive economic logic indistinguishable from Roman rule. This contradiction did not go unnoticed. The resentment was quiet but deep. People did not reject faith, they rejected hypocrisy. The institution that claimed to represent God increasingly resembled another mechanism of control. And when Jesus spoke about forgiveness without payment, release without sacrifice, and worth without wealth, he was not offering comfort alone. He was undermining the foundation upon which temple authority rested. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Jesus' teachings is the constant use of economic language: debts, creditors, wages, laborers, vineyards, stewards, masters, and servants. These were not abstract metaphors chosen for convenience. They were the grammar of daily life. People understood them instinctively because they lived inside them. Inequality was not theoretical. It was experienced every day in the form of unpaid labor, rising obligations, lost land, and shrinking autonomy. When Jesus spoke about forgiving debts, the audience did not hear metaphor. They heard possibility. When he spoke about the first becoming last and the last becoming first, it did not sound poetic. It sounded destabilizing. When he warned that wealth concentrated power and distorted justice, it aligned with lived experience. Productivity did not equal security. Obedience did not guarantee survival. Growth benefited a few and crushed the rest. This is why his words spread rapidly. They named what people already knew, but were rarely allowed to articulate. The Roman system relied not only on force, but on acceptance. It depended on the belief that suffering was necessary, deserved, or divinely ordered. Jesus' message disrupted that belief. He did not tell people to revolt. He told them they were not morally inferior for being poor. That alone was dangerous. Empires can tolerate suffering. They can tolerate inequality. What they struggle to tolerate is the collapse of legitimacy. Once people stop believing that their hardship is a personal failure or a divine requirement, extraction becomes more difficult to justify. Control becomes more expensive. Stability becomes fragile. The disruption in the temple was not a spontaneous emotional outburst. It was a calculated symbolic act. By overturning the tables of the money changers, Jesus was not attacking commerce itself. He was attacking the transformation of the sacred into a revenue stream. He targeted the visible mechanics of extraction, exposing the contradiction at the heart of the institution. By calling it a den of robbers, he reframed the narrative. The issue was not money existing in the temple. It was justice being excluded from it. This act forced a decision. Rome and the temple authorities could tolerate dissent as long as it remained abstract or contained. What they could not tolerate was public destabilization, especially during Passover, when Jerusalem swelled with pilgrims and historical memory of liberation heightened tensions. Crowds combined with grievance had a history. Revolt was always a possibility. From the perspective of power, Jesus had crossed from critique into threat. Not because he commanded armies, but because he challenged legitimacy. He disrupted flows economic, symbolic, and moral. He undermined the authority of institutions that depended on compliance more than belief. And compliance, once questioned, is difficult to restore. This is why the response was swift. The charge was not merely blasphemy, it was sedition. Not because Jesus planned rebellion, but because his message weakened the logic that kept people obedient. Rome ruled through efficiency, fear, and narrative. When narrative cracks, force alone is never enough. The execution of Jesus did not resolve the underlying pressures in Judea. It merely delayed their explosion. Economic extraction continued. Land loss accelerated. Debt deepened. The system became tighter, not looser. Within decades, the accumulated strain erupted into open rebellion. In 66 CE, Judea revolted. Rome responded, as it always did, with overwhelming force. By 70 CE, Jerusalem was under siege. The temple was destroyed, stone by stone. Its treasury was looted. Its priestly hierarchy erased. Hundreds of thousands were killed, enslaved, or displaced. This was not only a military act, it was economic restructuring. Rome did not simply suppress resistance. It dismantled the infrastructure that made resistance possible. But destruction did not end extraction. It streamlined it. Roman taxation intensified. Land consolidation accelerated. Debt did not disappear. The old moral language collapsed, but the material pressure remained. Rome won decisively in the short term. Territory was secured. Revenue flowed, order was restored. Yet something had changed. Jesus had not been building an army. He had not proposed an alternative state. He had not offered a new administrative system. His challenge operated on a different level. It questioned the moral logic that made domination feel natural. It separated debt from moral failure. It separated worth from productivity. It treated the poor not as defective, but as central. After the temple fell, small communities emerged that operated on different assumptions. They shared resources, practiced mutual aid, canceled debts within the group. Loyalty was based not on land, bloodline, or status, but belief. These were not revolutions. They were parallel systems, ways of living inside the empire without fully accepting its moral economy. Rome was effective at crushing armed resistance. It always had been, but this form of challenge was harder to extinguish. It required no territory, no centralized treasury, no visible hierarchy. It moved with people. It survived loss. It adapted under pressure. Over time, something unexpected occurred. Rome never fully regained control of the story people told themselves about power, suffering, and legitimacy. By the 4th century, the empire did not eliminate this alternative moral framework. It absorbed it. In doing so, it conceded something profound. Authority could no longer rest on force alone. Moral credibility mattered into power. The economy of Jesus' time reveals an uncomfortable truth. Systems do not collapse simply because they are unjust. They collapse when the narratives that justify them stop working. Rome optimized extraction. It mastered efficiency. But it never fully repaired the moral breach that made its dominance feel inevitable. Economic systems wrapped in moral language are extraordinarily durable. They survive hardship. They survive resentment. They even survive rebellion. What they do not survive is widespread disbelief the moment people stop accepting that suffering is necessary, deserved, or meaningful. History does not repeat, but it exposes patterns. Power defends itself not only with force, but with stories. Stories about merit, stories about necessity, stories about order. Once you see how those stories function, it becomes much harder to believe they are accidental. If this perspective changed how you see history, power, and money, subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.